Have you ever wondered what secret sorrow might drift onto your doorstep when you least expect it? One quiet morning, footprints and bloodstains on the riverbank set off a story that would test the limits of trust, healing, and belonging. When a wounded officer and his faithful German shepherd appeared at a lonely old sailor's door, three broken souls collided in a storm of choices, silence, and small acts of kindness. If you've ever lost someone or found hope in an unlikely friendship, this story is for you. What would you do if your greatest second chance came disguised as a stranger and his dog? Stay with us to the very end and discover how sometimes the softest moments sow the deepest roots. Share your thoughts in the comments. When did someone's quiet kindness help you find your way home? The first light of morning slipped quietly over the Columbia River, soft and gray, draping the banks in a pale, drifting mist. Out where the water widened and the salt of the Pacific mixed with the river's steady current, the air tasted faintly of brine and pine needles. A gull's distant call rose and fell, swallowed by the hush of the forest. Astoria, Oregon barely stirred behind the curtain of fog, a town half dreaming on its hillside, the bridge stretching out across the water like an arm half lifted in farewell. John Merritt sat alone on the old dock behind his cabin, boots resting on slick green planks, elbows on his knees, shoulders hunched against the lingering chill. His hand hung over the water, fingertips brushing the surface, feeling the shock of cold that cut through bone and memory. The ripples spread out in thin rings, vanishing into the river's slow, inexorable pull. He had been up since before dawn. Sleep had never lingered long for him, not in the years since he retired, not since the world had changed and closed in on itself. The notebook lay open beside him, pages fluttering in the breeze, the blue ink faintly smudged where the damp crept in. On the top line he'd written only a date, and below it, in careful, tidy letters, some things return with the tide, some are lost for good. He paused, pen motionless. The words pressed heavy in the quiet. The ache in his chest was not a sharp pain, but a familiar dullness, a bruise that never quite faded. He thought of his son, Peter, 15 years gone now, swept away in an accident no storm had warned him about. That kind of loss made time stutter and stretch, made every morning feel like a question he couldn't answer. So he had learned to keep moving, to find comfort in habit. Wake early, walk the riverbank, listen to the birds, and try to remember who he'd been before the world came apart. His eyes followed a drift of leaves floating past, yellow and curled, carried down from the forest with the night's rain. Beyond the dock, the reeds rustled in the faintest wind, and the fog thickened, swallowing shapes along the far shore. He rose with a quiet groan, stretching limbs that ached more each year. Slipping his hands into the battered pockets of his jacket, he started along the narrow trail that wound behind his cabin and down to the broad, sandy bend where the river met the bay. He walked slowly, boots sinking into wet moss, pine needles clinging to his soles, the world around him reduced to texture and sound, the creak of the dock, the hush of the water, his own careful breath. John's solitude was not bitter. It had become a part of him, the way salt became a part of the wind. The neighbors in town knew him, nodded if they passed at the market, but kept their questions to themselves. He let them. He was not unfriendly, only quiet, a man who watched the world rather than tried to change it. He had loved once and lost and loved again, if a man could call devotion to an old house and a notebook love. He sometimes wondered if healing was possible for men like him, or if peace was simply learning to live with the ache. Reaching the river bend, he stopped. The The sand here was pale and flat, the curve of it protected by a fringe of wild grass. John stooped to touch a shell half buried at the waterline, running his thumb along its broken edge. The wind shifted, colder now, bringing with it the faint metallic scent of rain not far off. It was then that he noticed something unusual, a scatter of prints along the edge of the bank, too large for the foxes that sometimes hunted here, too deep for a raccoon. He knelt for a closer look, brow furrowing. A dog's tracks, broad, defined, the claws leaving clear furrows in the damp sand. But not just tracks. Dark stains mottled the sand, soaking in, trailing toward the thicker reeds. John reached out and touched the stain. Even before he looked at his fingertips, he knew. Blood. He straightened, heart thudding, a deep, uncertain anxiety uncoiling in his chest. There were more prints, circling, doubling back, as if whatever had made them had lingered, uncertain or hurt. Nearby, another set of marks, boot prints, one dragging, pressed deeply, the stride uneven. He followed them a short way, slow, careful, every sense sharpened. He had spent his life reading the language of the sea, winds, waves, the silence that came before disaster. On land, the signs were quieter, but no less urgent. A disturbance, a wrongness that the morning did not explain. At the edge of the grass, something caught on a blackberry thorn, a scrap of blue cloth, torn and rain-soaked. John turned it over in his hand. Police uniform fabric or something like it. He held it a moment, thumb tracing the frayed edge, then tucked it gently into his pocket. The gulls cried again, closer now, wheeling above the water. John looked out across the bay, his reflection blurred in the river's restless surface. In that wavering image he saw a man grown old with sorrow, but still standing, still searching, still hoping for some small sign that not everything lost was lost forever. He stood motionless for a long time, letting the breeze chill his skin, letting the unease settle in his gut. Something had come ashore in the night, some struggle, some pain carried in by the current, left in blood and footprints on his quiet stretch of riverbank. The world, he thought, had a way of sending messages to those willing to notice. He turned back toward the house, moving slower than before, feeling the weight of old rescues, old regrets. The fog thinned as the sun began to burn through, pale gold illuminating the dew on grass and wood. In his pocket, the scrap of cloth seemed to pulse with hidden meaning, a reminder that even the quietest mornings could carry the beginnings of stories not yet told. John did not know yet what had washed up on his shore, or how it would change the rhythm of his solitary days. But as he walked the trail home, his boots leaving new prints in the damp earth, he felt, beneath the ache, a faint quickening, a question, a stirring of possibility. Not everything that came from the river was meant to be lost. Some things returned, some things asked to be found. Night came in heavy over Astoria, settling on the woods and river with the hush of falling rain. The wind had shifted by dusk, cold and relentless, pushing ribbons of fog through the pines and shaking loose needles onto the roof of John Merritt's cabin. In the distance, the horn of a barge echoed along the water, low, mournful, a sound that reminded him of distant shores and long crossings, of the ways a night could last forever. He stood by the kitchen window, lights kept low, listening to the drum of rain on glass. Sometimes, on nights like this, he imagined the past knocking at his door, a memory, a regret, a face he missed so much he could see it on the other side of the pane. But tonight, the world felt too restless for ghosts. Tonight, something heavier was moving through the dark. He made tea out of habit, chamomile, 2 fingers of honey, water brought just to a boil. and poured it into a chipped mug. His hand trembled slightly as he set it on the old wooden table, beside the worn notebook and the folded scrap of blue cloth he had found at the river. He had meant to forget about it, but couldn't. It sat there, a silent summons, soaking up the yellow lamplight. He barely heard the first knock, soft, halting, more a scrape than a sound. For a moment, he thought it was only the wind. But then it came again, unmistakable. 3 quick raps, followed by a silence that made his skin prickle. John's heart tightened, but his hands moved automatically. Muscle memory from decades on rescue ships, from too many nights when hesitation cost lives. He reached for his heavy flashlight, checked the lock, and stepped quietly to the door. Outside, the rain was relentless, sweeping sideways across the porch, hissing against the mossy steps. He opened the door just a crack, peering into the dark. The porch light caught the shape of a man slumped against the rail, his face turned away, hair plastered to his forehead. Rain dripped off the brim of his jacket, puddling around him. There was blood, a dark, glistening streak down his left shoulder, pooling on the boards. He looked young, but exhaustion and pain had carved lines deep into his skin. Beside him, half-curled, still but fiercely alert, was a dog. Not just any dog. Even in the dim light, John saw the strong, wolfish head, the thick gold and gray coat soaked through, the right ear cocked and the left sagging just a bit. The German shepherd's eyes met John's, startlingly bright, rich brown rimmed with fatigue. The dog made no sound, only pressed itself against the man's side, as if daring the world to come any closer. John did not hesitate. He pushed the door open, letting in a rush of cold air and the metallic scent of rain. He knelt beside the strangers, speaking not to the man, but softly to the dog. "Easy, girl," he murmured, letting his hand hang open in the air. "Nobody here means harm." The shepherd's body trembled, but she did not growl. Her gaze flicked to her handler, then back to John. Then she inched aside, allowing him close enough to check the man's pulse, a weak flutter under cold skin, but steady. The man's breath caught, a ragged sound, and his hand curled instinctively in the dog's fur. John slid an arm beneath the man's good shoulder, heaving him upright with a grunt. The man's eyes fluttered open just long enough for John to catch a glimpse. Hazel, clouded, rimmed with pain. His lips moved, but the words tangled and faded. The shepherd, seeing John take control, forced herself upright, favoring her left hind leg. She hobbled forward, nose pressed into the man's neck, whining so faintly it was almost lost in the rain. Inside, the warmth hit them like a memory. John laid the man gently on the narrow daybed beside the fire, stripped off the wet jacket, and pressed a folded towel to the bleeding shoulder. Blood seeped through, dark and stubborn, but he had seen worse. Much worse. He moved with purpose, fetching the first aid kit from the cupboard, hands calm, motions practiced. The shepherd watched every move, planted at the man's feet, wet fur slicked flat, ribs rising and falling in shallow waves. John spoke again, not expecting answers. "Hold on, son," he said softly, fingers testing for broken bones, for damage that would not show on the surface. He cleaned the wound with iodine, wrapped it tightly, left the rest to time and luck. For the dog, he fetched an old wool blanket, laying it beside the bed. The shepherd circled twice, then, as if remembering another time, another home, settled down. She rested her head on the edge of the mattress, eyes never leaving the man's hand. A hush settled over the room. The fire snapped and hissed, casting restless shadows across the walls. John brewed tea for the stranger, set it on the table untouched. He peeled off the shepherd's collar gently, found the tag, Greta, K9 Rescue, Astoria PD. So that was her name, Greta. He whispered it, and the dog's ear twitched, but she did not move. John placed another blanket over the man, then left to find dry towels, a spare shirt. He paused by the door, listening to the rain, the wind, the silence inside his own chest. There had been so many nights like this, when someone washed up on his shore in pain, asking for nothing but a safe harbor. He had learned, long ago, that sometimes the only thing you could offer was warmth and quiet, a dry place to heal, and a promise, silent but real, that you would watch over them until morning. So he sat in the old armchair by the fire, his hands folded, the dog's eyes reflecting the flames, and waited with them for whatever came next. Rain pressed steady against the windows, a soft percussion against old glass. Inside John's cabin, the world seemed smaller, wrapped in a hush broken only by the fire's quiet crackle and the slow, laboring breaths of the two unexpected guests. Shadows gathered in the corners, the lamplight settling on weathered floorboards and faded wool rugs, turning the space gold and dim in turns. John moved through the house in practiced silence, shoulders set, boots light on wood, careful not to disturb the delicate calm that had fallen. He'd taken care of wounded before, men and women hauled out of the Pacific, battered by storms, shaken and shivering and silent. He recognized the shape of exhaustion in their faces, the slackness of limbs, the way pain and hope mixed in the way they clung to consciousness. It was the same here tonight, but quieter. No alarms, no voices, just the breath of rain, the sigh of a man asleep, and the loyal gaze of a dog who would not sleep at all. On the bed by the fire, Lucas Bryant lay curled under a blanket, eyes closed, face turned toward the orange glow. His breathing had settled, no longer ragged, but the bandage on his shoulder bloomed with fresh red, the color vivid against the white gauze. John checked it with gentle fingers, found the bleeding had slowed, then covered the wound with a clean towel and let the man be. Greta had not moved from her spot on the rug. Every so often, her tail would twitch, or her eyes would flick toward the door, listening for dangers only she seemed to sense. Her flanks rose and fell quickly, the tremor in her hind leg more pronounced when she shifted. John noted the way she pressed closer to Lucas's hand whenever his breath hitched, her nose bumping his knuckles, her whole body speaking comfort. He set a mug of steaming tea on the small table beside the bed, its surface crowded with small objects, a flashlight, a stub of pencil, his old notebook open to a blank page. The quiet filled the room like a presence, not empty but dense, alive with memory and waiting. Outside the rain softened, easing to a drizzle. The wind lost its edge. Through the old lace curtain, John saw the darkness of the pines, the gentle movement of the river beyond. He felt the old ache in his chest, a space that loss had hollowed out but never quite claimed. In the kitchen, he prepared a simple meal, canned soup, bread sliced thick, a jar of applesauce he'd made from the late autumn harvest. He placed it all on the table without fanfare, letting the scents fill the small house. He thought of calling the hospital in town, but hesitated. The man's badge had looked real enough, but something in the way he clutched his dog, the way they'd both ended up on a stranger's porch in the middle of a storm. John sensed this was not the kind of trouble you called others into lightly. Some people washed up on his shore for a reason. Some simply needed shelter, not questions. He sat at the edge of the bed, careful not to startle Greta. The shepherd's eyes followed his every move. He reached out, letting her sniff his hand before brushing damp fur from her face. "You've done well, girl," he said, voice low, barely more than a murmur. Greta blinked, her ears flattening. Then, in a rare moment of vulnerability, she rested her head against his wrist. John stroked the ridge of her back, feeling the tremor there, the heat of a body still fighting for calm. Lucas stirred. For a moment, confusion flickered across his face as he took in the strange room, the old beams, the unfamiliar ceiling. Then memory caught up, and his eyes closed again, mouth set in a line of pain and gratitude. John left him a glass of water and a dry towel for his forehead, then rose and moved to the far side of the room, where the fire burned low. He added a log, prodded the coals to life, and watched the sparks leap and fade. The heat climbed slowly back into the air, and for a while the only sounds were the shifting of logs and the whisper of Greta's breathing. He let the evening stretch, gave it room. Sometimes he knew words were less important than presence. He had learned, long ago, the power of a warm room, the promise of a watchful eye, the simple mercy of silence. Greta's eyes met his, and in that look was an understanding older than speech, a dog's steady faith in the kindness of strangers. As night deepened, John prepared a makeshift bed for himself on the old couch. He set a blanket nearby for Greta, though she would not leave Lucas's side. He checked the locks, peered out into the rain, and then sat by the window, writing a line in his notebook by candlelight. "Tonight, the world sent me two souls in need. I have nothing to give but shelter and quiet. May it be enough." He lay down without undressing, boots still on, arms folded across his chest, eyes open to the flicker of the fire. The cabin breathed around him, old wood settling, the gentle sighs of sleeping and wounded things. Somewhere in the night, Greta finally drifted into a wary sleep, head pressed to her handler's chest, one ear cocked, the other drooping. Lucas slept too, breath soft, lost in dreams neither pain nor memory could touch. Outside, the rain paused, and in that fragile silence, John closed his eyes and let himself drift. Not into sleep, but into a place between waking and memory, where loss and hope could share the same small room, where three hearts beat quietly together, bound by storm and kindness and the simple, ancient desire to survive until morning. Morning drifted in slowly, the gray light filtering through the pines and the window panes, settling soft and unhurried on the old wooden floor. Rain had eased into mist, and every blade of grass, every roof shingle, every slat of the dock shimmered with a fine bead of water that caught the sun's first uncertain rays. The river, seen through the kitchen window, seemed to breathe, rising, falling, folding in on itself as if the world were exhaling after a long, tense night. John rose before the others, an old habit never truly lost. The house was still, the embers of last night's fire resting in a cradle of ash, the kitchen cool and faintly scented with apples and pine. He moved quietly, setting water to boil, slicing bread, listening for the creaks and sighs of sleep and healing. On the table, his notebook lay open, and beside it, the small torn scrap of police blue fabric. He touched it with a fingertip, almost absent-minded, as if weighing the meaning of another person's trouble in the hush of his own. In the other room, Lucas shifted, drawing a sharp breath as pain found him before consciousness did. Greta, already half awake, responded first, nose pressed gently to Lucas's hand, a low, encouraging whine. The dog's devotion was silent but absolute, as steady as the morning tide. By the time John came to check, Lucas was sitting up slowly on the bed, every movement careful and considered. He looked younger in the morning light. His features softened by fatigue and the shock of survival, dark hair in damp tangles against his forehead. The wound on his shoulder was angry but no longer bleeding. The feverish flush had begun to fade. John offered him water, which Lucas took with a grateful nod. The silence was gentle, unforced. Two men accustomed to quiet, to holding their words like stones in a pocket, letting them grow smooth before letting them go. John saw Lucas's eyes fall on the notebook, open to a page headed by a phrase written in tidy block letters, "Save whoever you can." Lucas's gaze lingered there, as if startled to find something of himself in another man's handwriting. He said nothing. Greta, ever watchful, came to stand beside John, her gait slow but determined, her eyes bright with intelligence. She pressed her head gently against his knee, the weight both an inquiry and a gift. John felt the old ache in his chest loosen just a little. He crouched, running a gentle hand along Greta's side, pausing at the scar tissue above her back leg. The dog leaned in, sighing quietly. Trust offered. Trust accepted. Lucas watched this exchange, a flicker of emotion passing behind tired eyes. He tried to speak, his voice rough from disuse and pain. "She's Greta, Astoria K9. She saved me more times than I deserve." John looked up, not answering. He returned to the kitchen, leaving the notebook open, the page as invitation rather than interrogation. He made a pot of black coffee, the scent rising to fill the house, then sliced an apple with a paring knife, placing the crisp white pieces in a chipped blue bowl. When he brought the coffee to the table, Lucas had gathered himself enough to sit upright, one hand resting protectively on Greta's head. There was no rush, no demand for stories or explanation. The house held its quiet, holding space for the unspoken. At last, Lucas spoke almost to himself. "Didn't mean to trouble anyone. Was just the only place left." John poured the coffee, set the bowl of apples between them, and sat down opposite. "You're here now," he said simply. "Rest is up to you." Greta moved closer to John, nudging the man's palm until he scratched behind her ear. In the kitchen's quiet, with the window fogging softly in the damp, the three of them formed a fragile constellation. Man, dog, stranger, each bearing their wounds, each offering something the others needed without knowing exactly what it was. John glanced at the notebook on the table, then pushed it gently toward Lucas. "For what it's worth," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Writing things down sometimes helps." Lucas's hand trembled as he touched the cover, but he did not open it yet. Instead, he looked at Greta, then at John, then at the window where the river flowed on, endless and unchanged. In that stillness, the house remembered things left behind: laughter, voices, the thump of a child's feet on old wood, the whistle of a kettle. John let the memories move through him, not pushing them away, not clinging either. Loss had taught him to leave space for both ache and hope. As the morning deepened, the air warmed. Greta stretched, limped to the threshold, and lay in the spill of light across the floor. Lucas, guided by the gentle rhythm of the room, accepted a slice of bread, chewed slowly, hands finally at rest. How John moved about his chores, never far, never too close, always watching. The silence was not emptiness, but invitation, a place where wounds could breathe, where memories could surface without shame, where even the loneliest souls could find, for a moment, the possibility of belonging. Afternoon settled over the cabin with a hush, the mist giving way to a bruised sky, thin shafts of light glinting on the river, as the world held its breath between showers. The quiet stretched long and unbroken. Greta, belly rising and falling, lay curled in a patch of sun by the door, her fur catching the gold like a faded halo. John moved through the rooms with an unhurried step, tending small chores, mending a loose hinge, washing the breakfast dishes, sweeping stray pine needles from the entryway. Lucas lingered at the kitchen table, cradling a mug in both hands, gaze drifting from the battered notebook to the rain-streaked window and back again. There was a line across his brow, a kind of stubbornness or worry, or both. The silence grew companionable, touched with a waiting energy, as if the cabin itself was listening. At last, as the sun dipped behind a low bank of clouds, Lucas set the mug aside. He cleared his throat, the sound small but startling. Greta's ears flicked toward him, her body tensing as if she too had been holding a story back. John looked up, his eyes steady, offering nothing but patience. Lucas began haltingly, words emerging in fragments, shaped by fatigue and the uneasy burden of memory. "There was a call," he said quietly, his thumb tracing the rim of the mug. "Down by the old wharf. Suspicious van. I was supposed to just check it out, make a note. Didn't think it would go sideways." His voice drifted, caught by the soft tick of rain against the tin roof. "There was a man, big guy, moved like he didn't care who saw him. I thought I had backup coming, radioed it in, but..." He shrugged, helpless. "Sometimes help comes too slow." Greta lifted her head, dark eyes fixed on Lucas, as if urging him onward. "She smelled trouble before I did," he continued, voice low. "Started pulling at the leash, growling, like she knew. Then the man ran. I chased. I shouldn't have. But there was a kid, teenage boy, maybe 15, standing too close, wide-eyed. I just reacted." Lucas's hand trembled. John set a can of fish on the table, simple, steady, the way a sailor shares a meal with a shipmate lost at sea. Lucas nodded his thanks, took a forkful, then continued, his gaze never meeting John's. "We got separated. Greta went after him, tracked him to the warehouse. I followed, but it was dark. There was shouting. 2 men, maybe more. One had a pipe, the other a knife. I tried to get the kid out, but I wasn't fast enough." He paused, swallowing hard. Greta pushed her nose into his thigh, anchoring him. "One of them hit me from behind. I went down. Greta, she fought. I heard her snarl, louder than I'd ever heard. Then the pain, sharp, right here." He touched the bandaged shoulder. "Blood everywhere. She got between us. Took a blow for me. Drove them off, I think. I blacked out." He shook his head, jaw clenched against something old and heavy. "When I came to, she was there. Limping, bleeding, but nudging me, barking until I woke up. The kid was gone. Ran off, I hope, back home. Greta led me out the back, through the rain, toward the river. I don't remember much after that. Just the cold, her body against mine, keeping me moving. I thought, if we could just find someplace, any place that wasn't dark and wet and hopeless." His voice broke. Fading to a whisper, John let the silence absorb the words, not asking, not judging. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the branches against the eaves. He poured tea into 2 mugs, slid one toward Lucas, and then went to the door, opening it to the scent of damp earth and distant salt. Greta limped to the threshold, nose working the air, ears cocked for the sound of footsteps that did not come. She paused, then turned, her gaze searching John's face as if measuring his own scars against her pain. John crouched, hand gentle on the shepherd's side. "You did good, Greta," he said, quiet as a prayer. she sighed, pressing close, accepting the kindness with the dignity of the wounded and the brave. As dusk gathered, the three of them sat beneath the low porch roof, sharing bread and fish and the hush of early evening. No one spoke of fear or failure or the weight of mistakes. Instead, they watched the clouds drift above the river, listened to the slow breathing of a day almost done, and let the ordinary miracle of surviving another night settle deep into their bones. In the pale light, Lucas felt some knot within him begin to loosen. Not undone, not healed, but held for now in the gentle company of an old man, a loyal dog, and the endless song of rain and river. The storm passed quietly in the night, leaving the world rinsed and trembling in the pale clarity of early morning. John rose as the first light traced silver across the windows. The house felt different, still marked by fatigue and the memory of pain, but threaded now with a sense of company, however fragile. In the hush that followed the rain, the river seemed to breathe more softly, mist curling along its banks, birds calling tentative greetings from the edge of the woods. Lucas lay on the bed, one arm draped across his chest, eyes closed but not asleep. His features were slack, but not unguarded, worn down by worry, yet oddly at peace. The bandage on his shoulder had stopped bleeding. Greta, ever vigilant, pressed herself close against his side, the steady rhythm of her breath sinking to his, an anchor for both of them. John moved through the small house, gathering what supplies he had: old gauze, a bottle of hydrogen peroxide, a chipped bowl of clean water. He knelt by Greta as the shepherd lifted her head, ears twitching, eyes patient and trusting. John's fingers were steady as he checked her leg. The wound was not deep, but the skin around it was hot and faintly swollen. Infection lingered at the edges, threatening to make old hurt new again. Lucas roused, blinking away the haze of half-sleep as John pressed the damp towel to Greta's leg. "She's tough," Lucas murmured, voice low and hoarse, a quiet kind of pride threading his words, "but she's not invincible." John nodded, not looking up. No one is. He cleaned the wound, gentle and thorough, his hands moving with the certainty of someone who had mended sails and tended the battered hands of men at sea. Greta watched, ears half lowered, trembling only once as the sting of antiseptic met the rawness of her skin. John murmured something under his breath, soothing her, and Greta seemed to understand, settling into the pain with a patience born from years of loyal work. Lucas watched, gratitude clouded with helplessness. "She was always the one who fixed me," he said, barely above a whisper. "Never needed much herself. But I'm not sure what I'd do if—" The words trailed off, unfinished. John's gaze flickered to him, the kindness in his eyes quiet but unmistakable. "We take care of our own," he replied. "Sometimes that means letting someone else hold the line." The ritual became a rhythm. Twice a day, John and Lucas worked together to change Greta's bandage, one steadying the dog, the other cleaning, wrapping, speaking soft words neither quite needed to say. There was an intimacy to it, not of confession, but of trust earned in silence. The old man's hand brushing Lucas's as they worked, the three of them bound together by shared purpose. Breakfast was simple: toast and eggs, the yolks golden and bright. Greta lay beneath the table, chin resting on her paws, tail thumping softly whenever John dropped a crumb or Lucas bent to ruffle her ears. The room filled with the smells of coffee and warm bread, the scrape of plates, the small sounds of people learning how to share space after long solitude. Afterward, John opened the back door to the day's thin sun. He and Lucas stood together for a moment, watching the river drift past, light flickering in and out of the water like something alive. Greta limped to the threshold, settled herself in the square of sunlight, eyes half closed, content to listen to the hush of the house, the pulse of the world beyond. The hours slid by with the grace of habit. Lucas dozed, the weight of pain and sleepless nights making his eyelids heavy. John busied himself in the garden, pulling weeds from between the flagstones, his mind wandering through memories of a younger man, of a different kind of morning. Now and then he glanced toward the open window, listening for movement, his thoughts oddly content. That afternoon, a gentle rain returned. Just a thin drizzle, enough to scent the air with wet earth and bring out the song of frogs in the reeds. Lucas sat on the porch steps, a mug of tea cradled in his hands. Greta lay at his feet, head tilted to watch the droplets bead and roll off the edge of the roof. John joined them, settling on the top step with a sigh, his own cup sending up curls of steam. No one spoke for a long while. There was comfort in the presence of others, in the shared silence, in the slow return of ordinary things, a porch, a river, the low hum of life unbroken by fear. As evening drew close, Lucas tried to protest when John insisted on cooking supper, but John only shook his head. "You rest," he said, in the unyielding voice of someone who had spent years looking after others. "Let an old man have his way." Greta, sensing the shift in mood, rose and pressed her nose into John's palm, tail thumping, a gesture of thanks or understanding, or maybe just the kind of faith a dog saves for the few she chooses to trust. That night, the three of them shared a meal in the amber light, rain tapping at the windows, the fire crackling low. Greta curled between them, letting herself drift into sleep at last, the wounds on her leg and in her heart softened by the company she had found. In the hush, John wrote a single line in his notebook. "Even broken things can learn to rest in the light." Mist clung low to the riverbanks that afternoon, blurring the edges of trees and water, turning the old fence posts along John's yard into half-remembered ghosts. The air was thick and still, so quiet you could hear the click of a raven's beak in the distant pines, the far-off whine of a single engine somewhere out on Highway 30. The peace felt thin, as if the world was only borrowing silence for a little while. John had spent the morning stacking firewood in neat rows beneath the porch eaves, sleeves rolled, the rhythm of the axe and the scrape of bark steadying him. Lucas rested in a lawn chair nearby, watching Greta, who seemed stronger now, limping less, pausing often to sniff the shifting breeze. The day passed in the unhurried way of all good days. Coffee cooling on the rail, the slow wash of sun and cloud, the sense of having survived something that might, with luck and care, remain behind them. But peace, John knew, never lasted forever. Not for men or dogs marked by trouble. Not for those whose paths had been crossed by hurt. It was Greta who noticed first. She had been lying on the porch, chin down, eyes narrowed at the line of cedars near the road. Her body tensed, one paw lifted, ears pricking. Lucas saw it and straightened, every muscle stiffening in response to the sudden, silent alert. John set the axe aside, following Greta's gaze, his old instincts flaring, the kind that never left a man who'd waited too many nights for the weather to turn, or the radio to crackle with bad news. From the edge of the mist, the faint crunch of gravel. The shadow of a vehicle, black, boxy, out of place among the pickups and battered station wagons that usually came this way. It slowed as it neared the property, headlights flickering through the branches, engine idling low. No one spoke. Greta rose, limping a little, but her stance was proud, tail held level, her gaze unblinking. Lucas put a hand to her neck, his thumb brushing the matted fur behind her ear, a gesture meant for calm, but more for himself than for her. The car pulled to a stop just beyond the gate, tires sinking into the wet ruts. For a long moment, nothing. Then the doors opened. 2 men stepped out, shapes blurred by fog and distance, but their movements were sharp and certain. John recognized the type, the way they scanned the yard, the way they spoke in short gestures rather than words. He had seen men like them before, never in uniform, always looking for something that didn't belong to them. He watched as they prowled the edge of his property, boots crunching old pine needles. They did not call out. Instead, one bent low, running a finger along the mud near the gate, the faint outline of paw prints, dried blood, a sign left unintentionally in last night's haste. The other kicked at the fence, testing it, then spat into the dirt, a thin line of tobacco and contempt. Lucas stiffened, breathing shallow. Greta pressed closer to his leg, but did not whimper. John made his way inside, motioning for Lucas and Greta to follow. Once the door closed, the small house felt even smaller, its walls grown thick with the tension of danger returned. John moved without hurry, but with the old economy of someone used to emergencies. "Basement," he said simply, voice flat but steady. Lucas nodded, guiding Greta down the narrow steps, careful to keep her weight off the injured leg. John took a moment to scatter sand over the porch boards, covering the traces of blood, then slid the bolt on the door. He moved through the rooms, drawing the blinds, turning off the lamps. The world shrank to shadows and heartbeats. In the basement, the air was cool and damp. Cardboard boxes lined the shelves, old life jackets, the ghosts of summers spent on the water, photo albums never opened. Lucas found a patch of bare floor, easing Greta down, his hand on her ribs, listening to the low thunder of her heart. They waited. Upstairs, muffled footsteps, boots on wood, a scrape against the siding. Voices low and rough, the words lost in the walls but the meaning clear. The men lingered for long minutes, opening and closing the gate, muttering, throwing a stone at the shed before climbing back into their car and vanishing into the mist. John let the silence linger even after the engine faded. Only then did he move through the house, pausing at each window, every sense strained for another sign. When he was sure, he descended the stairs, shoulders heavy but face calm. Lucas looked up, question in his eyes, but John shook his head, a tiny, reassuring gesture. "We stay low for now," John said, voice little more than a breath. "They're looking, but they didn't find what they wanted. Not yet." Greta, exhausted but undaunted, nudged her nose into John's palm. He smiled, worn but real, his thumb tracing the line of her muzzle. For the rest of the day, the 3 of them moved quietly, voices soft, doors closed, shades drawn. John taught Lucas how to scatter coffee grounds near the fence line, an old trick for masking scent, for buying time. He showed him the safe places in the woods, the paths only a local would know. Lucas listened, grateful for the old man's caution, and for the silent presence of the dog who never left his side. That night, as the fog thickened and rain whispered again against the roof, the small house was filled not with fear, but with a kind of gentle resolve, a promise held in the eyes of an old sailor, a wounded cop, and the dog who refused to give up hope, no matter how many shadows circled just beyond the light. Night pressed close around the cabin, heavy and restless, thick with the memory of the stranger's boots on the porch and the knowledge that safety was always, at best, a fragile truce. A hush had settled on the house after the men left, a kind of reverent stillness. But beneath it, unease moved like a slow tide, pulling at the edges of comfort. Lucas sat at the small kitchen table, shoulders hunched, hands knotted together in front of him. His eyes drifted from the window, black glass, rain-streaked, to the mug of untouched tea cooling by his elbow. Greta lay curled beneath his chair, her body finally slack, exhaustion overtaking vigilance. Even in sleep, her nose twitched, one ear cocked toward the door. John moved quietly around the room, making small repairs, the steady clink of tools and soft footsteps a counterpoint to the anxious beat inside Lucas's chest. There was a question in the air, unspoken but thickening as the hours passed. How long could they stay hidden? How long before trouble returned, less patient, less willing to be turned away by locked doors and drawn curtains? Lucas rose and moved to the window, lifting the curtain just enough to look out at the muddy yard, the old fence gleaming wet in the porch light. His heart ached with the familiar dread of bringing danger to another man's home. He had spent years learning how to carry his burdens alone, always pushing forward, refusing help. It had worked, until now. He turned to find John standing in the doorway, arms crossed, eyes shadowed but clear. The old man's silence was different tonight. Not wary, but watchful. Lucas searched for words, but his throat felt tight. The apology caught somewhere behind his ribs. John spoke first, voice low, each syllable weighed with care. "You're thinking of leaving." It wasn't a question. Lucas hesitated, then nodded, ashamed. "I don't want them coming back," Lucas said, the words spilling out faster than he intended. "Not for me, not for her. You shouldn't have to." John shook his head gently, and the movement stopped Lucas mid-sentence. "For years," John began, voice steady, "this house was a place to hide. For me. I thought if I kept quiet, nothing else could get in. But you showed up, both of you. Needed help, needed a place to heal." He stepped closer, the floorboards creaking beneath his boots. His hand, rough and scarred, rested on Lucas's shoulder, a touch meant not to restrain, but to anchor. "Sometimes," John said, softer now, "we don't get to choose who comes into our lives or when. Sometimes we only choose if we're going to turn them away or let them stay." Lucas swallowed, words trembling on his tongue. Greta, sensing the change, rose and pressed her head against John's knee, eyes shining with something deeper than loyalty. A long moment passed, full of what could not be spoken. Outside, the river moved unseen in the darkness, the sound of its current rising and falling like a quiet song. John's grip tightened for an instant, then loosened. "If you're not ready to go," he said, "then don't. Not yet. There's no shame in resting a while longer." Lucas closed his eyes, letting out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. In that space, relief mingled with shame and gratitude, a complicated ache but less sharp than before. He lowered himself back to the table, Greta settling at his feet once more, her sigh soft and content. John set about making a late meal, the easy motions of slicing bread and heating soup filling the kitchen with warmth. Lucas helped where he could, moving slow, pain flaring and ebbing with each movement, but soothed by the rhythm of work and the knowledge that, for tonight at least, he was allowed to stay. Later, they ate together by lamplight, three figures framed in a pool of gold against the gloom. Conversation, when it came, was spare and gentle. Lucas told a story about his mother's cooking, the smell of cinnamon and coffee in a small apartment in town. John shared a memory of the ocean at night, stars burning clear above the black water. the sound of the waves a lullaby for old wounds. Greta, content and healing, stretched out between them, her tail thumping every so often, her body finally at peace. When the meal was done, John produced his battered notebook, tore out a clean page and set it on the table in front of Lucas. "Write it down," he said quietly. "All of it. Doesn't have to make sense. Just get it out of your head." Lucas looked at the blank paper, pen trembling in his hand. For the first time in days, he let himself believe that healing was possible, that rest was not surrender, but a way to gather strength for whatever would come next. That night, after the lamps were dimmed and the last rain whispered against the windows, John sat on the porch steps, looking out into the darkness. Greta pressed close against his side, Lucas standing silently behind them. Together the three watched the faint silver thread of the river in the distance, three shadows on the edge of the world, joined not by blood, but by the simple, stubborn grace of not letting go. A pale band of morning stretched over the river, lavender and blue melting into pearl as the first light edged across the windowsill. The night's fears seemed smaller with the day, though they hadn't vanished. They clung at the corners of the kitchen, in the bruised skin beneath Lucas's eyes, in the way John's hand lingered on the coffee mug, turning it slowly in the hush. Lucas had barely slept. He sat at the table, shoulders hunched, tracing the wood grain with the tip of his finger. Greta, head pillowed on her paws, followed his movements with patient, dark eyes. There was a stillness in the house, a kind of expectancy, as if the river itself held its breath. John moved through the morning routine, quiet but purposeful. Kettle filled, water boiled, coffee poured black and strong. He set 2 mugs on the table, slid one toward Lucas and sat across from him, the silence comfortable in a way that only comes after fear has been spoken and survived. Lucas stared at his coffee, then up at John. There was a weight behind his gaze, an old shame, a gathering resolve. "I need to call it in," Lucas said finally. The words hung in the air, fragile but true. "I can't run from it anymore. They deserve to know, my chief, the department, about what happened, about Greta, all of it. I should have done it sooner." John nodded once, neither encouraging nor warning, only listening as one man does for another when decisions come hard. He reached across the table and slid his battered cell phone toward Lucas, the movement steady and sure. "Do what you have to do," John said. "No one's going anywhere today." Lucas hesitated, thumb brushing the cracked screen, then dialed the station. The ring seemed to echo in the small house. On the other end, voices, a dispatcher he recognized, clipped and cautious. He gave his name, his badge number, a brief summary. He told them about the wharf, the men, the wounded, the dog who saved his life. He answered questions. He listened to the sternness in the chief's voice, the relief when he confirmed Greta was alive. He took it all, the skepticism, the support, the instructions to stay where he was until backup arrived. When he hung up, the silence rushed in again. Lucas sat back, eyes burning. Greta thumped her tail and rested her chin on his foot, as if she understood the meaning of duty, the ache of facing the consequences, the strange quiet that comes with confession. John reached into a drawer and drew out his notebook, old, creased, heavy with years of memories and loss. He slid it toward Lucas, the pages trembling slightly in the morning light. "A long time ago," John said, voice gruff, "I wrote down everything I was afraid to say out loud. I wrote about Peter, about the sea, about mistakes I couldn't undo. Sometimes it helped. Sometimes it just kept me company. Lucas turned the book in his hands, feeling the weight of stories pressed between each line. I don't know where home is anymore, Lucas admitted. Feels like I left it behind, or it left me. John looked at him, the old man's face softening, the lines around his eyes deepening with a kind of kindness that required nothing in return. Anyone can be lost, John said. Anyone can find their way back. Maybe not to the same place, but to somewhere that lets you rest. Greta sat up, stretching slowly, then padded to the door, whining softly. Lucas followed her, the screen door creaking open to let in the chill of dawn. Mist drifted over the river. Dew clung to the grass, and the faint promise of sun painted the yard in silver. They stood together on the porch, John beside them, three figures at the edge of the world, watching as a police cruiser wound its way up the muddy drive. Greta barked once, clear and strong, the sound ringing with something bright, neither warning nor fear, but hope. A uniformed officer stepped out, a woman with salt and pepper hair and a gentle steadiness in her walk. She approached slowly, hands open, posture unthreatening. Lucas straightened, his heart hammering, but Greta pressed close, tail wagging low, sensing no threat. The officer listened as Lucas spoke, halting, honest, sparing no blame for himself. She crouched to stroke Greta's head, nodding with understanding at the old scars and the fresh bandage. She offered Lucas a ride, a chance to clear his name and Greta's, to face what came next with the truth out in the open. Before Lucas left, John pressed the notebook into his hands. "Take it," he said. "Write your own ending, if you want." Lucas stood by the patrol car, looking back at the little cabin by the river. Greta hopped up into the back seat, her face turned to the window, eyes calm. For a moment, Lucas hesitated, torn between the safety of staying and the necessity of leaving. John raised a hand in farewell, just a small motion, but filled with the quiet pride of a man who knew what it meant to let someone go. As the cruiser pulled away, Greta barked again, the sound sharp and bright, echoing across the water. John stood in the new sunlight, hands in his pockets, letting the day wash over him. The river moved on, steady, forgiving, filled with the promise that every ending holds a new beginning somewhere beyond the bend. Spring crept softly over Astoria, laying a gentle green across the moss and stone, coaxing daffodils and wild violets from the damp soil by John's porch. The river ran high and restless after the winter thaw, its surface broken by silver glimmers of fish and the swoop of early swallows returning home. The wounds of winter lingered, but the air was warmer, laced with the scent of cedar and new beginnings. John Merritt knelt in his small garden patch, his hands deep in the earth. He moved slowly, the work measured and careful, savoring the feeling of dirt beneath his nails. It was a quiet ritual, a way to honor the rhythm of the seasons, to remember what could be restored if tended patiently. The beds had gone wild with neglect in the months before, overrun with tangled grass and the brittle remains of last year's blooms. Now, each handful of rich black soil felt like a small promise kept. Beside him, Greta sprawled on the porch, her golden coat gleaming where the sun caught it. She watched John with half-closed eyes, occasionally stretching one paw to catch the breeze or to nudge a clump of violets closer. She was mostly healed now. The fur along her flank had grown back over the old scar. Her limp had faded to the faintest hesitation, and her eyes held the gentle brightness of a dog at peace. Whenever John paused, she would glance up at him, tail thumping in the dust, and he'd reach out to scratch behind her ear. The house felt changed too, Where once it had been a place of waiting, a shelter against storms, a vault for memory and regret, it had become something quieter and more hopeful. Lucas had left his jacket slung over the back of a chair, his handwriting still marked on a scrap of paper tacked to the kitchen wall. John sometimes caught himself listening for the sound of his laughter or the low murmur of his voice as he read or wrote in the evenings. A reminder that even the smallest acts of company could outlast absence. It had been a month since the patrol car carried Lucas and Greta away up the muddy drive. News traveled slowly in town, but John heard enough that Lucas's report had been taken seriously, that the men who had brought trouble to his porch had been found, that Greta's service was being honored, and that forgiveness, though hard-won, had been given. Lucas had been cleared of any wrongdoing, his courage quietly recognized by his peers and the town alike. Still, the road back was not an easy one, nor a straight line. John did not expect to see him soon, but one morning, just as the river fog began to lift, he heard the sound of tires on gravel, the familiar engine of an old truck. Greta sat up, ears pricked, tail sweeping the porch boards. John straightened, wiping his hands on his jeans, and watched as Lucas stepped from the cab, a canvas bag slung over his shoulder, and a shy smile on his face. He looked different. Not healed, perhaps, but lighter somehow. His posture less guarded, his eyes clearer. Greta bounded off the porch, meeting him halfway with a flurry of happy barks, her tail a golden banner behind her. Lucas knelt, arms open, letting the dog press her weight against him, both of them trembling with relief and joy. John watched from the steps, letting the reunion unfold in the gentle hush of morning. When Lucas finally stood, he reached into his bag and pulled out a small box and a sack of seeds. "For the garden," he said, voice low but sure. "And for Greta, a new collar. She earned it." John accepted both gifts, nodding in thanks, the words caught in his throat. He saw the new collar, blue leather, soft and sturdy, with a tag that read simply, "Greta, always home." The three of them spent the day together, working quietly side by side. John showed Lucas how to press seeds into the damp soil, the earth cool and alive beneath their fingers. Greta trotted between the rows, sniffing each mound with the careful curiosity of one who knew how fragile new life could be. At noon, they shared a simple lunch beneath the old willow by the river, a meal of bread, apples, and strong cheese, laughter coming easier as the hours slipped by. They did not need to speak of what had happened before, or of the wounds that had brought them together. Instead, they let the sun and the quiet and the gentle touch of hands and fur write the next lines of their story. As afternoon faded to gold, John fetched lemonade from the kitchen, and the three of them settled on the porch. Greta lay sprawled between them, her head resting on John's boot, tail curled around Lucas's foot. The air hummed with the sound of bees in the flowers, the river glinting in the distance, and the low, peaceful hush of lives no longer lived in the shadow of fear. John looked out over his small, newly tended plot and felt a quiet pride, not just in what had been saved, but in what had been allowed to grow again. He thought of his son, of the years lost to sorrow, of the men and dogs he'd seen come and go. He thought of how trust, once broken, could be sown again, slowly, with patience and the willingness to remain, even after the world had turned cold. Lucas reached down, resting his hand atop John's. Greta's tail thumped once in reply, a benediction. They sat that way until the sun slipped behind the trees and the shadows stretched across the porch. No speeches, no promises, only the sure, slow company of healing and the gentle certainty that whatever storms returned, they would face them, together, with kindness and the hope that, somewhere between loss and return, everyone could find their way home. Sometimes the greatest healers come on four legs, bearing scars we cannot see, teaching us that it's never too late to choose kindness or to let someone back into our quiet world. As the seasons shift and wounds begin to mend, we find that home isn't just a place, but the hands we reach for and the lives we touch along the way. Maybe you, too, have carried burdens in silence, or met someone, human or animal, who helped you find hope when you thought it was lost. If this story spoke to a part of your own journey, I'd love to hear about it. Was there a moment when a simple act, shared shelter, gentle words, a loyal companion, changed your path? Please share your thoughts in the comments. Your story may be the gentle light someone else needs tonight. And if you found meaning here, I invite you to stay with us for more stories that honor the quiet, enduring bonds between people and the animals who walk beside us.